Okay, good afternoon. I think it's appropriate to get started, and before I introduce the panel, I'd like to welcome everybody here this afternoon to our discussion, which is entitled The Future of Global Governance, Time for Government 2.0. And I would like to point out that maybe the major scope of our discussion today is that the major international organizations which address many of the global issues such as trade, finance, diplomacy, and economic development were created shortly after the end of World War II. But the world is quite different today than it was at that time. So the question that we're going to consider are issues such as economic development, poverty, energy security, climate change, technology. Have all of these things changed enough that we should take a fresh look at how effective our organizations are and how capable we are to address the challenges that can be resolved only through global collaboration? And I think we have a great and very qualified panel here today. I'd like to take a few moments to introduce the panel before I call on them to make some comments and to answer some questions that I'm going to use to stimulate discussion. First of all, I'd like to introduce Agustin Carstens. He is Mexico's Secretary of Finance, right here. Following a distinguished career at Banco de Mexico, he was Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and today he also serves as the Chairman of the World Bank IMF Development Committee. To his left, an administrator of the UN Development Program, Kemal Dervis, has led the UN's Global Development Network since 2005. After Turkey's financial crisis in 2001, Dr. Dervis left his post at the World Bank to fashion an economic recovery program as Turkey's Minister for Economic Affairs. And he was also a member of the Turkish Parliament. To my immediate right, Pascal Lamy, Director General of WTO, and in two separate tenures he served as the European Commission, most recently as the Commissioner for Trade. In between those tenures, he played an important role in rescuing Crédit Lyonnais and later becoming its CEO. I guess that was about 10 years ago, and rescuing banks, unfortunately, is still the business occupation today. To his right, Kumi Naidoo has been Secretary General and CEO of Civicus, an international alliance dedicated to strengthening citizen and civil society action. Dr. Naidoo was the founding executive director of the South African National NGO Coalition and has actively worked for gender equity and against apartheid. To my immediate left, Sadako Ogata is currently the president of Japan International Cooperation Agency, which offers international development assistance. She was previously co-chair of the Commission on Human Security and Prime Minister Koizumi's special representative for Afghanistan assistance. And of course, from 1990 to 2000, Ogata-san was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And on my far right, Bob Zoellick is the 11th President of the World Bank. He previously served as the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and U.S. Trade Representative. And before assuming his current position at the World Bank, he was Vice Chairman International of Goldman Sachs. So the process that I thought we would follow today is to put some questions to the panelists to stimulate discussion among the panelists at the beginning, and then we're going to open it up to the floor and encourage a lot of questions, and I hope that in the next a little over an hour or so we will accomplish something that we all can take away from here that will benefit us. So I'd like to start with Mr. Dervis. There's been much change in the world since the post-World War II creation of global institutions such as the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. How might these institutions be modernized to reflect the circumstances of 2008?
Well, maybe it's good just to remember for a minute, where all this came from. It came from probably the biggest catastrophe, at least in modern history, that was the Second World War, and of course even everything that led to it, the Great Depression, the First World War, the horrible events that surrounded all this, the Holocaust and all that. And out of there grew the United Nations system, the Bretton Woods institutions, and even indirectly the WTO. They were post-World War creations. I think in many ways they've been quite successful. They have avoided at least huge catastrophes since then. They have contributed to avoid that. But we are today in a completely different world. We see for the first time that it is the Asian economies that are the drivers of economic growth. The Western economies in Japan remain very important. But for the first time we see that maybe even a recession in the United States will not lead to a world recession. Why? Because the Asian economies and many of the emerging markets have now a considerable share of the world economy and are responsible, in fact, for the majority of the growth that will take place in the next 2 years. The challenges have changed also, the kinds of challenges we face. Although peace remains, maintaining peace does remain, of course, the most fundamental of all challenges. So that's the one point I'd like to make to start. Second, I do believe it's important to stress, and in Davos it's kind of obvious, but that we're not here, when we think of global governance, global institutions, global cooperation, we have to think of civil society and the private sector as well as intergovernmental relations. Global governance cannot be any longer just a matter of governmental relationships. So the importance of the private sector that is, of course, increasingly internationally organized, the importance of civil society that also has become global, these are very positive factors and help a lot towards creating the kind of governance mechanisms in the world that we need. Having said that, however, for very important questions, for a lot of the really crucial questions, the intergovernmental institutions are still extremely important. We're not going to have a good, satisfactory non-proliferation world or control of the nuclear cycle through the private sector or through civil society. We need governmental cooperation for that. We need it for peacekeeping. We need it in the trade arena, and we also need it in terms of regulations of the financial sector. We need it, of course, in the health area. So there still is, despite the very positive contributions of civil society and of the private sector, there is need for government, for public policy, for public policy coordinations, and therefore there is need for strong international institutions, given that the markets and the interactions have become so global. At the heart of the system, there is the United Nations, and there is no substitute for it. For all its inefficiencies, all of the duplications that often take place, the United Nations is the core of the international cooperation system, and therefore having a United Nations system that reflects the challenges of the 21st century is really extremely important. We cannot continue with a Security Council that essentially dates back to 1945. We must reflect in the most important organ of the United Nations, the Security Council, the new balance of power, of economic influence, of resources that exists in the world. We must find a way. And of course it's very hard because the 5 permanent members have a veto power. And therefore through the veto they can just stop it. And it's been stuck for more than a decade. When I came to the United Nations, I actually wrote a book on this before I joined, and people told me, Kemal, please don't get too excited about it. It's hopeless. There's the veto power. It will never be overcome. You better think of something else. And I'm dealing with the economic side. Right now, it's not really my job to think of the Security Council. But the Security Council, being the most important organ of the United Nations, the only one that can really make decisions, I do still strongly believe, and in this setting I can say it, I'm not going to advocate one model or another, but as long as we continue with a Security Council that does not reflect the realities of the 21st century, the United Nations will be weaker and weaker. Of course, some want the United Nations to be weak. That's a different story. But if we want an effective United Nations, a legitimate United Nations, we must come back to the reform of the Security Council. In terms of the Bretton Woods institutions, I leave it more to Bob Zoellick. But, it is still true that at the World Bank, Belgium has a larger share than Brazil. I mean, this cannot work. You cannot have a legitimate Bretton Woods governance system with these kinds of weights. And here, the responsibility actually rests quite a bit with Europe. Because what leads to these strange weights is the fact that intra-European trade, intra-Eurozone trade, is counted as international trade in the formula. So either you're going to change the formula or you're going to have to deal with this issue. And Europe will have to make a move here. If Europe doesn't make a move, arithmetically, there's really no way to rebalance the ownership structure properly. I think Europe can do this without losing much influence, because if it's more cohesive, if it's more united in its policies and in its representation in one form or another, it will still remain probably the single largest shareholder as the European Union. But if you divide it into all the countries and add it up, there's no space. In the case of the Bretton Woods institution, the problem is not actually with the US, because the US shares about 17%, which reflects more or less, a reasonable weight of the US economy. So these are just two examples of where decisions are really needed. I won't say anything about WTO. I leave this to Pascal. And I think unfortunately, we have these key problems that get us stuck. We can't move because of these key problems. Maybe during the discussions, we'll have time to get back to that.
Well, thank you, Kemal. Let me turn to Mr. Lamy, since the WTO has come up and as an example of an organization which has broadened its membership over the last decades and gives each member a voice in key decisions. Is this a model for the future, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of the WTO system?
Well, starting from your initial observation, I think the WTO is one example of a concept which is basically the same as it was 60 years ago, but the thing has totally changed. If you compare the conclusion of the first GATT round in a smoke-filled bar in Torquay, south coast of England, and the ministerial 205 with 2,000 participants from the member state, 2,000 NGO present, and 2,000 journalists present, it's not the same thing, obviously. The membership has changed totally. The problems on the table, in 47 was, maybe you could reduce a bit of your tariff on batteries and maybe I could do something for you on my scrap metal. That was what a round was. It's totally different now with agriculture, subsidies, trips. The agenda has changed totally. The membership has changed totally. So as an organization, I think it has adjusted permanently to the challenges it has to face, including in geopolitics stemming from geoeconomics. So we've been flexible. We've adjusted. Now, why is it so? Probably because we have a formidably light institutional structure. There's one thing that hasn't changed in 60 years, which is that WTO, as GATT, is a member-driven organization, that decisions are taken by consensus, by the floor. We have no board. The WTO DG has an extremely limited, if any, executive authority, which, by the way, is defined nowhere, which is, the best way of making sure you don't have a strong institution is not to define the authority it has. Not that. In everyday life, we don't have to adjust to that, but that's a reality. Now, so in many ways, we may have adjusted permanently because of our sort of quite flexible structure. And this structure has remained flexible because we belong to the good old Westphalian system. Sovereignty of nation state, one nation state, one vote, consensus. Which, of course, in terms of efficiency, is often extremely frustrating. Making sure 152 members agree on a 20 items agenda, each of which necessitates to agree on 60 technical parameters, is long, complex, frustrating, ups and downs and tactics and combinations. But I think we are a rather good example of a compromise between efficiency and legitimacy, which is a problem all governance systems have. So we may be a bit light on the efficiency side, and I totally recognize that, and I know that in business there's a wide view that, let's say they would get around in Doha in 2001, we're 6 years after. What are these guys doing? Well, remember the previous round. Started in 86 and lasted 8 years with approximately half of the active membership we have now and approximately 1/3 of the topics we have. So we may not be that efficient, and I recognize this, but we have kept a huge sort of legitimacy with our members. Now, of course, this is not sufficient. I spend a lot of time with NGOs, with oppositions in parliamentary systems, saying, your theory of legitimacy, which is that you're legitimate because you're member-driven and your members are citizen-driven, that's just a theory. Now, sorry, but this is the theory of the international system today. I'm not sure I agree with that. But the reality is that since 1648, we have sovereign nation states who contract or decontract international obligations, set up organizations with specific purposes, the coherence of which they monitor. Those of us on this tribune do not monitor a lot of what we have to do together. Our members do that. Now, maybe doesn't fit with today's reality, but this is the theory within which we have to live. We are member-driven, and the monopoly of coherence still lies with our members, which sometimes is a bit paradoxical, when I have to answer NGOs, say, well, this WTO thing is just the black box of multinationals, corporates cooking dirty deals, which are now imposed on our populations. If they feel it this way, it's probably that the theory of legitimacy of the Westphalian system is not totally convincing. But the theory remains, we are member-driven, our members are citizen-driven, consensus ensures legitimacy. Now, does this sum up the whole answer to your question? No. We have the media, and of course, internet is eating more and more about media interaction in various forms. We have a civil society. We have lobbies. I mean, the WTO rules on access to generics would not be what they are if only nation states had been cooking a deal. NGOs strongly intervened in that. We would not have a chapter of the negotiation on subsidies fisheries if it was only about nation states. So they do start to have some influence, but it's outside the theory of the system. Business groups do have an influence in WTO. Trade unions do have an influence in WTO, but they have a voice, not a vote. That's the limit of the system, and whatever we do beyond this, we do it at some risks that our members are going to hold us accountable of things we've decided to do without their clearance. Some of us, Kemal, Bob, on this tribune, we're ready to take a risk from time to time, not too much.
Well, thank you. Let me ask Kumi Naidoo, you represent an organization that promotes citizen participation in governance. And how can we best harness the power of citizenry in today's world? And how effective is this?
In the civil society movement, some of you might remember in the early 1980s, there was a slogan that said, think globally, act locally. What was behind that slogan was irrespective of the issues that you were tackling at the local or national level, you needed to better understand how global institutions, global discourse, and global processes have an impact on what you can or cannot achieve at the national level. However, one of the ironies of the moment of world history that we're living in is that precisely at a time when many countries were acquiring democracy for the first time, including my own South Africa in the early 1990s, real power was shifting from the national to the global level around issues of trade, environment, currency management, and even addressing an issue such as HIV/AIDS, because of the pricing of life-saving pharmaceutical drugs are not determined at the national level. You cannot actually fight those struggles at the national level and succeed. So therefore, within civil society, we've had to begin to recognize that sometimes we have to think what are our local or national concerns and needs, and if real power rests with global institutions, we have to actually act and advocate at those institutions. What we have found, however, is that the global system is desperately ill-prepared to actually handle the burdens of responsibilities that have been placed on it. And I will quickly summarize 4 deficits that the current global governance system suffers from. The first deficit is a democratic deficit. Kemal has already alluded to the issue of the United Nations Security Council. But what we mean by this is that the whole system is stuck in the geopolitics of 1945, with the exception of the WTO. So, for example, while it might have made sense for Britain and France in 1945 to have the veto because there were colonial hegemons controlling large amounts of the world's population, given their population size in this day and age, there is no persuasive argument as to why they should, other than you say they should be rewarded because they have weapons of mass destruction. But if you then look at those that have weapons of mass destruction, which are nuclear weapons, then you have to add India, Pakistan, even maybe North Korea on the permanent 5. But if we take an institution like the World Bank, for example, which preaches good governance to the developing world, and we look at the governance of the World Bank itself, it falls short very drastically. The idea that the president of the World Bank, and this is not personal, Robert, of course, has to be an American citizen is problematic. Right? Jim Wolfenson, who became a good friend of mine after many advocacy struggles we had to give up his Australian citizenship to be able to become the president of the World Bank. The idea that a global public institution should be allocated to one nationality whose population size is 5% of the global population doesn't make democratic sense. The second deficit we have is a coherence deficit. What I mean by this is that the proliferation of global governance institutions leaves a situation at the national level where your finance minister is going to the World Bank and IMF, your foreign minister is going to the United Nations, your health minister is going to the World Health Organization, and so on. And Pascal will know that the burden on developing countries to have the capacity to participate in these global events, negotiations, and so on, it's very unequal. So the European Union will have a delegation at the WTO delegation meetings of 100 or so people. I'm thinking of Hong Kong, for example, and the developing countries do not have the same technical, financial, and so on capacity to be able to participate in an equal level. So the coherence deficit is nationally, but also we would urge the organizations that constitute the global governance galaxy to start talking to each other and actually working out ways to actually work more effectively together. The third deficit is a compliance deficit. The sense we have is that many times when our national political leaders go to global summits, by the time the ink is dried on the commitments that they've signed, and by the time they've landed back on the capitals, that in fact the commitments that are made are not followed through. So if you go and analyze all the UN summits over the last 20 years and you do a quantification of how much of those decisions made at very expensive cost, by the way, and a huge cost to the environment with all the flying and so on that happens, how much is actually delivered, I would be surprised if the turnaround in output terms is more than 20% of implementation. So given that situation, civil society is a growing force in the world. We must remind ourselves that the preamble of the United Nations founding documents does not say we the nation states of the world. It starts by saying we the peoples of the United Nations. And therefore, we have advocated and we've opened up space, not to the extent that we would like to see. Some institutions are better than others, to ensure that we are able to participate and bring the perspectives of ordinary people into these global discussions. Now, what we would urge is that there has to be an investment in terms of looking at what are the modalities to enable civil society to participate more effectively. What we would say to the leadership of the global governance institutions is don't deprive yourself of a reservoir of free policy intelligence, experience, knowledge, both from successes and failures that civil society groups have had in the policy-making work that you need to do. And sometimes, if you want decisions made by global governance institutions, like, for example, the Millennium Development Goals, if you look at who has been pushing the Millennium Development Goals since 2000 to ensure that our governments are held accountable to deliver, 90% of that push has come from civil society organizations, and I would argue that the limited progress that we've made towards the Millennium Development Goals would not have been there had it not been for the efforts of civil society. So to round up, I think that we are living in a context now where there is a desperate need to ensure that all parts of society are able to feed into making important global decisions that will affect future generations on this planet. And the challenge to the leadership of all the global governance institutions, we understand, as Pascal explained, that it's politically tricky to actually deal with governments on the one hand who are your paymasters and who are the ones that you are formally accountable to, but still don't let those difficulties lead you to a position where you don't invest enough resources to look at the creative ways of which civil society can participate at the delivery level, at the policy influencing level, but also in hearing our ideas about how to transform these institutions such that global governance institutions are genuinely democratic, genuinely transparent, that there's coherence, and also that ultimately that they comply with the expense, with the decisions that they make at huge expense both to the national treasuries as well as to the global environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. Now, you gave me a good opening to turn to Bob Zellick and ask a little bit about the World Bank. And, I guess the first question, Bob, it's two questions. One is maybe you could address Kumi's very first point about the presidency of the bank, again, not being personal. But the second issue, I think, more broadly, is does any of this resonate in ways that might make the bank more effective in getting in dealing with its mission, in getting development funds and appropriately applied to where they're needed?
I'll come to the presidency point, but I want to try to address the structural issue first. When people have these discussions about international institutions governance, they tend to take two paths. One is process and one is substance. The process ones tends to focus on the structural issues, which we've devoted almost all our time to. And believe you me, they can include a lot of improvement, but they can also be diverting and very insular. We have examples of other multilateral institutions that had one country, one vote, like the League of Nations. That didn't seem to work so well. That's one reason you've shifted to a different model. Doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to upgrade the different relative power shares. But it suggested something about power shares because one of the lessons of that interwar period was it wasn't enough to have voice and representation, although they're important, but you also have to have responsibility. Now, one reason why this debate can sometimes become a little overwrought is that while you do have votes, for example, in the World Bank group based on relative size of economic shares, the reality, which Kemal actually sort of touched on lightly, was If you actually did it on the basis of economic shares, the U.S. share would go up in these institutions. I don't know if that's what people want. And in reality, we try to work towards consensus decision making. We have very few formal votes based on the shares. We try to bring everybody along. And I think that makes sense because if you think about the mission of the World Bank, it's not just determined by the shareholders. It's determined by a common interest in development and growth, and therefore you have the clients playing an important role as well. But the reason why I wouldn't spend endless amounts of time on this goes back to the point that Pascal mentioned. We have shareholders. They're sovereign governments. That's the piece of the Westphalia system that he talked about. They're the ones that make decisions, and fundamentally those decisions are based on some sense of their interests and their power relations, and sometimes bureaucracies separate from those. So you can spend a lot of time trying to evolve these systems. It's worth some effort, but not a total preoccupation. Take, for example, the World Bank. We have a resident board. It was designed for a system before air travel. Okay? I just left a meeting of a whole series of finance ministers that were kvetching about the role of a resident board. I said, many of you are the ones that have the countries that can make the decisions. But it's not worth their effort to deploy the capital to change what is a fundamental institutional system that would have to go back through all their governments and constitutional systems. Beyond the question of power relations, I want to stress a point that Pascal mentioned, and others did as well, which is that sometimes what to the outside world seems to be the incoherence of the institutions is driven by the fact that the sovereign states that are members of those institutions may not have coherent positions across the institutions. And so what we try to do as best we can is point that out and find the common ground. But I want to turn to the substance, because my own belief is the real challenge for these institutions is to demonstrate their effectiveness with the world of 2008 versus the world of 1944. So to me, the big issues are globalization, which offers tremendous benefits, but also threats and challenges people, and you have counter-reactions of isolationism, protectionism, nativism. You have the challenge of rising economic powers. This is not a new question in history, and it reflects things like voting, but it also reflects what role and responsibilities they're going to play. We have questions of Islamic radical terrorism, where you have a group of people that are rejecting integration, they're rejecting modernism, they're trying to go back to a different view in time that I don't believe can be replicated, but they can do a lot of destruction along the way. And you have global climate change, where, as Pascal will tell you eloquently, some of the people now that sort of believe you don't need to deploy political capital to close the WTO round may find that you're going to deal with the similar set of issues and conflicts and tensions in global climate change. And if you're unable to get a trade round done, believe you me, it's not going to be so easy to create a new climate change regime. What all this reflects is globalization and deeper integration. So I believe you need multilateralism more than ever to make this work. But our challenge is, how do we make multilateralism work? And this is another dimension. It's much more of a networked model now, and not just the public international institutions and how they relate, but the sovereign governments, private profit-making, and also private nonprofit. And you're definitely right. There's a key role here for civil societies, developing countries, the transparency, focusing on the issues. Although I would also suggest that it's important for civil societies to recall that sometimes their legitimacy is not always the same as they assert it is. The One World Institute did some work on the transparency. World Bank came out way ahead of most nonprofits. So this is also a question of democratic society, how you participate in democratic society, how you have the legitimacy. And the reason this is sensitive actually comes from some of the NGOs from developed countries. In developed countries today, you'll find NGOs, for example, that are talking about the importance of climate change. But if we want to develop, for example, hydropower in Africa, even though you have hydropower in Europe and North America, no, we can't build dams anymore in developing countries. Well, of course, there are questions and troubles about how you deal with local communities, how you deal with the issues, but there has to be some consistency as well, and the debate among civil society organizations represents advocacy groups. Coming from a democratic society, I think it's important to have broad-based advocacy groups from developed and developing countries, but still to work within some system of legitimacy, and as Pascal said, that still comes back to the nation state. Second to last point, while we should keep some hope, is that having been in the private sector as well as the public sector, it's important to keep in mind that some of the toughest problems we have in the world are the ones that we leave for the public sector. So some of the questions of war and peace, some of the questions of broken societies, how do you deal with environmental issues of commons? How do you bring all the parties together in trade? How do you address poverty and create opportunities for development? We ought to be honest, these are not easy questions. If so, there were capable people before that would have answered these things. And so part of this is we need to recognize we're going to make mistakes. And we shouldn't necessarily penalize all parties for making mistakes. We need to learn lessons and move forward in that process in an open democratic system with civil society groups being critics, and we need to be open to analyze ourselves and have honesty and integrity about what works and doesn't work. So it's not a reason for despair, it's a reason to continue to move forward with these challenges. And the last point on the presidency of the World Bank in particular, I was chosen by a process of these sovereign governments. So frankly, it's not my choice, it's their choice. And so my simple solution to this is I try to do the best job that I can in the system, and people can make their choices going forward. I will add one more element, and this doesn't relate really to me, but it does relate to the system. For those in the international community that are worried now and then about sort of U.S. and multilateralism, just as somebody who's also been involved with domestic politics, just be a little careful before you start to push the U.S. out of these institutions. You may get what you want, and it may not really be what you want. Because, for example, if the U.S. public starts to feel that they're more detached from some of these institutions, whether it be the UN or the World Bank or protectionism, you might find that some of the problems become harder to resolve because the U.S. still represents about 25% of the world's economy and is going to be important to solve them. So that doesn't necessarily mean for this position or any others, but I'm just saying when I deal with these issues, I try to deal with the combination of legitimacy and effectiveness, but also reality. And where I keep coming down is the best thing that I can do with the World Bank is to try to work within the current framework to try to solve some of these problems. And that's how I think we'll make multilateralism work.
Okay, well, thank you, Bob. Let me turn to Agustin for a moment. You're the president of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, which contributes to the economic and social advancement of developing countries, and are an expert on development, which, as Bob rightfully pointed out, this addressing poverty is very difficult and challenging and not so easy to do. From your perspective, how is the system working and how might it be improved?
Well, I realize that I'm the only one representing a national bilateral development assistance agency. We're not entirely outside the international global governance system. I think we feed into that. But we're not bound by the various constraints that you have been expressing. The Japan International Cooperation Agency basically started as a technical assistance agency. We were focused very much on Asia, and a lot of assistance went into Asian countries. But now with many of the Asian countries, including China and all the Indo-China countries and so on, advancing a lot, we are shifting a lot more of our resources to Africa and the Middle East, where the needs are much greater. So in this sense, we follow the global need and also assist bilaterally various countries in the world. I have an office in 56 countries. So it's quite a large national development agency. And in this sense, we are very much, right now, the resources that I have at my exposure is about $2 billion in implementation. At the same time, due to privatization in Japan, the government bank, JBIC, the soft loan portion of JBIC will be integrated into JICA. So in this sense, we will be having technical assistance, grant aid, and soft loan all together, and I think we will be getting closer to what the World Bank represents. What does this mean really in global management or governance? I think what we will be trying to do is to make sure that we directly deal with governments, the governments we assist, and the people. Before globalization days, I think bilateral agencies only focused on governments as the recipient. But the globalization trend has changed these requirements into making sure that what we give is not only what the government receives and uses at their own discretion, but make sure that it benefits people as well. Because the globalization means governments and people are both very, very important. As Kumi has said, it's not just governments that run everything. The globalization means beyond borders. People are very much the big players. So our focus is really community development in various countries. That's one point that I think globalization has made difference. Also, that the scheme, the objective of our assistance is not technical assistance, means really developing the technology, technical skills of people in developing countries in a way that they can manage their own development. That's one of the. But you do need large-scale grant aid to do the big infrastructure buildings, and also not only grant aid, but also a lot of soft loans. And this is where we are very much cooperating with the World Bank and some of the regional development banks, because infrastructure is very, very important. Economic development, economic growth of developing countries are very important, which requires a lot more, much more inputs in financial resources. But what kind of governance are we under? We are also very much under the scrutiny of efficiency and effectiveness. And you have to run an organization efficiently with as little as possible of our funds going into management. I think that's where most donor governments tell international agencies too. And then which have to show effectiveness. And with this merger of the JBIC yen loan part coming in, it's a huge operation we have to manage. But the expectation is that with everything together, I should be able to get results out in half the time. Efficiency and speed is what is expected. The idea is that if you have too many players around, you end up being more and more bureaucratic, which means it needlessly delays process. The globalizing world is also an impatient world. They want effectiveness and results much more quickly than they used to. So in this sense, it's a very challenging time for bilateral development assistance agencies like JICA. I think we have to change our outlook to looking at recipient governments or NGOs or various other international agencies as being much more on a partnership basis. We're not donor-recipient relations, we do the development together. That kind of mental change is very much needed, and this is where we're trying to work towards. So I would say, if you give me any words, that we'll just have to spread our efforts much more speedily. And this is a big challenge that Japan's overall ODA is declining. This is why we're expected to be more effective and efficient. And that's a hard thing, very hard one to live up to. Just a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Agustin. Before we kind of broaden the discussion and open it to the floor, we have one other panelist I would like to hear from, and that's Minister Carstens. You've been involved with the IMF. You're currently Minister of Finance in Mexico, part of the Economic and Social Reform team. Very effective, surprisingly effective reform of the public pension system in Mexico last year. From an economic perspective, an economic development perspective, how do you see the global institutions? And maybe we could get your perspective on the G8, the G20, or other directions you'd like to take the discussion before we broaden the discussion out.
Well, sure. Thank you very much. I would like to make some comments about the Bretton Woods institutions and then jump into other fora like the G20, the Financial Stability Forum, and so on. I think Kemal and Bob and Pascal have introduced some interesting points and important points to evaluate many multinational agencies. And it's very important to have very clear why there is a distinction between, for example, the UN system and the Bretton Woods institutions. And that is the one country, one vote, mostly in the UN system, and a different type of voting system in the Bretton Woods institutions. The main reason is that in the Bretton Woods institutions, we are talking about the use of resources. I mean, countries have pledged resources to these institutions, and I think it's fair that the taxpayers who have put those monies for international purposes will have their voice heard and represented at the time the decisions are made. So I think that to have a proportional voting to the participation in the institutions is a solid principle that I think should be respected. Now, the problem is that through time, those institutions and the power structure that is there has not allowed the change in the participation in the capital of the institutions. I mean, the main reason why Brazil, for example, has a lower share than Belgium is, or Mexico, is because we are not allowed to increase our contribution according to our size. And that, of course, affects legitimacy and affects the willingness of countries to accept and to own the recommendations of those institutions, because those recommendations goes at the heart of policy making in the countries. The conditionality on IMF loans is that you have to affect your monetary and fiscal policy according to the recommendations of an international body. Now, if those bodies are not legitimate and the countries do not feel some form of ownership to those institutions, there are real problems in effectiveness, which is the second point that Bob raised, legitimacy and effectiveness. So if there is no legitimacy and the sense of ownership, the effectiveness of the institutions is hampered. And therefore, the ultimate goal, the common interest, as Bob mentioned, will not be achieved. In the font is very clearly the lack of parity between the size of a country and the participation of that country in the world economy, just because the size of the loan you can get in times of hardship is proportional to your quota. Now, if your quota doesn't get adjusted in 40 years and you have grown far more, then what the IMF can do for you is completely useless. Or what happens is that reality, as Bob put it, forces the institution to improvise, no? And when the institutions start improvising, then the whole thing becomes far more complicated. Because why are you improvising in a positive way with Mexico, which we have benefited from improvisation, and not to other country, no? So it really is important, this issue of legitimacy and ownership, because it affects effectiveness. And I think the way Bob put it is very useful. I think that reality is important, no? It is a reality that Korea, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa now have a much stronger weight in the world economy that is not recognized. Now, I also recognize that the US position is stronger, and I wouldn't have any problem if that is reflected in the institution. It's a reality, and we need to find ways to deal with that reality. Now, other fora has been created to sort to reduce or mitigate some of these complexities I have been mentioned. For example, the creation of the G20, the creation of the Financial Stability Forum. I think that they are, in some sense, positive steps, but at most they're transitory steps. Because at the end of the day, I mean, yes, in the very short and immediate term, they provide a window of opportunity, especially the G20, to some emerging markets to sit at the table with the G8 and have their voice heard. But at the end of the day, it is not a decision-taking body, and also it weakens other institutions. I think that debate in a more appropriate in a more appropriate fashion would need to be taken place, for example, at the Fund or the World Bank. No? Why do we need to take the discussion outside of institutions we already have, where they have the advantage, no, that at the board of the World Bank and the IMF are decision-making bodies, no? So in some sense, they provide some relief, but on the other sense, they weaken the institutions we already have there. In the Financial Stability Forum, I think it's even worse, because there it's just a club of industrialized countries. And the reality is that now the financial system is global, no? And I think that to not have the representation of emerging markets is not appropriate, no? To start with, for example, now the Financial Stability Forum is discussing the recent financial crisis in the US and in the industrialized countries. Let me tell you, emerging markets have a lot of experience in those type of crises. We have been there. We have seen that film many times. And I think that we can provide useful advice, no? There is an additional point too. For example, in many emerging markets, the participation of global institutions is very important. And therefore, we would like to see firsthand what the authorities of industrialized countries are thinking about the way their problems are going to be solved. So I think that at least the Financial Stability Forum could be more inclusive, and I think it would be more effective in reaching its ultimate objective. So, I mean, in principle, I think that the governance of the Bretton Woods institutions, the core of it, the original ideas are adequate, but we should apply them according to the reality of the moment we are living. And yes, I think that we should be concerned about the sense of ownership and legitimacy because it affects the effectiveness of those institutions. So I think that we should discuss it further and try to get some flexibility, because if not, Bob said, for example, you know, at some point the US might get fed up with this discussion and leave. A reality is that because where the situation is right now, many countries are falling through the cracks, and many countries are not getting anything out of being a member of the IMF and the World Bank. And that is a reality, and I think that the whole multinational system loses if, for example, the US gets fed up and leaves, but also it loses a lot if many countries fall through the cracks, they don't feel represented, and they just don't participate. So I think we have to find the middle of the road where all the countries feel represented, feel that the institutions have legitimacy and become effective.
Thank you, Minister Carstens. Let me, we have a microphone in the room, and what I'd like to do now, I mean, we've covered a wide range of opportunities here. We could probably spend hours talking about this. So if you could keep your questions brief, I would really appreciate it so we can maximize the next 15 minutes. So I've got a question right here, and then we'll come here. Please. And if you just identify your name and then the question.
I'm Daniel Lubetsky from the Peaceworks Foundation. I really appreciate your insights, but I want to be a little provocative. and say that a lot of them, I think Mr. Carstens is hinting at some of the challenges ahead, but a lot of the models for how we can resolve these things are going to be bottom-up rather than top-down, and taking advantage of technology and all the advance. A lot of the things that that we see happening with the internet in information and consumer gathering of data from YouTube and other things are going to put pressure on governance and global governance. And the last question I want to provoke you with or relate to, that see if any of you guys can have solutions to, is David Gergen spoke to a lot of young global leaders a couple days ago and told us that this is the first generation that can be global stewards, that you really can have a global impact. But if you want to do that, you need to have a global identity. And I think having a nation-state identity, which dates back to the 17th, 18th century, is going to be very limiting. We need to try to really be global citizens. So what models can you advocate to help all of us see our shared human values and build upon that recognition that to tackle these problems, we need to put the globe ahead of our nation-state conceptions?
Okay. Who would, someone like Bob, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit more complicated. I think you're going to need multiple identities. If you just listen to this discussion, and you could see still the vital importance of the nation state. And a lot of those political decisions are going to be made at the nation state level. And frankly, there's a lot of people that have very good ideas about global integration, but if they don't have power in their home political systems, they're not going to affect their nation state. And it really goes beyond the nation state. You're talking about local and global. In a sense, people are going to have to recognize, and this isn't hard, sometimes people have an identity with a community, sometimes their school, sometimes a club and background. But I think a greater agility and understanding the concept of integration and how you can try to find win-win solutions across that set is really going to be the challenge for all of us. And even coming back, I thought Agustin made a very excellent combination. But just even take the challenge one step further. I agree with his idea that readjusting the shares, but the problem will partly be a lot of the poor African countries would end up being really low. And so part of the notion of this cooperative is we're going to have some offsets for them, because what you said might be better for the middle income countries, but what about the sense of some of the countries in Africa that would have little or no share? So this challenge of balance is, I think, a key one, but I would keep coming back to the fact ultimately institutions are going to be judged by what they do. And let's focus on results.
Right here in the front row, please.
Matuk Jannah, Saudi Arabia. Just two short questions. We're hearing that protectionism is coming quite a lot on the way. How does this seem from a WTO point of view? And on the current economic crisis, and the G8 is coming to meet soon in May, isn't it better that it is looked at by a G8 plus rather than just a G8? Thank you.
Let me put the first question to Pascal Lamy.
Well, I think you're right. There are some worrying signals that protectionism might be on the rise. For sure, quite a lot of rhetoric. To be frank, not that many deeds at this stage. But, we know that in politics, rhetoric may be a precursor. Now, that's not a new thing. We've had that for ages, and it usually we have more of that in terms of bad periods than good periods. It's in the Bible, basically. We've had that in the last century at a big scale, at a globalized scale. The domino effect of protectionist measures and whatever proportion historians put in the causes of the Second World War, a part of that led to the biggest terrible thing which this planet has known, as Kemal said. Now, following this, wise people decided that they'd better have an insurance policy. You know, when your house has been totally destroyed by a big fire, the next time you try and make it not happen. And they've steadily built, year after year, round after round, a solid system of insurance. Now, that's not free. From time to time, you got to reinvest in your premium. Not least because, you know, politics and economics is a sort of live thing. You have to adjust to that. And this time, I think, if humankind is a bit wiser as a function of history, as a function of reflecting on this, we have a very clear vision of what the risks are. And we know how to hedge them. And we have a perfect occasion to do that, which is, you know, giving the signal that the members of the WTO are ready to do the last mile of a big negotiation they started, which has a technical and economic, a trade and a geopolitical dimension. So the best thing to do is use your insurance company, the one you've built together. Not all WTO, not all members of the WTO are there. Not all the nations of the planet are members of the WTO, but you know, we're nearly there. So you have this collective instrument, just use it.
Thank you. Kemal, do you have a comment on the broader participation on the economic issue?
Well, I want to support Agustin's statement in that connection, that of course there has to be an equilibrium between informal mechanisms, leading nations. It exists in the trade field, it exists everywhere. In the climate issues, you know, so the big players get together and all that. But you see, if one goes too far in that direction of forums, and the G8 has no real legitimacy, and neither would the G12 in some sense. We do have the fundamental kind of legal structure, I mean, I would call it almost legal, of the Bretton Woods institutions, of the United Nations system, of the WTO. And I would submit that we have to make that work. That doesn't mean that there will not be informal meetings, you know, such as the Stability Forum or whatever it may be, the G8 or the G12. But the fundamental challenge still is how to make that system work. And we need these public institutions. The private sector can do a huge amount, has done a huge, is driving world growth, civil society, you know, unions and all that. But when there's a big crisis, whether it's a nuclear issue, a climate issue, or even the financial issue now in the US, you know, the public sector has to come in. Public policy has to come in. And so fundamentally, we must also make that work.
Thank you. A question here, and then I'll come over here. Thank you.
Does Mr. Naidoo realize that his best allies are the people in here, and the best allies are the institutions they run, plus some others that, and that working with them is his best hope of delivering the best results to his constituency?
Kumi.
Well, what makes you assume that I'm not working with them? Well, firstly, most of the civil society organizations that I'm associated, including my own, I don't know whether Bob knows this, but under a previous regime, when Jim was there, my organization took a huge risk and entered into a partnership with the management of the bank to foster a global dialogue between civil society and the leadership of the bank to come up with a mechanism of how to engage with civil society. And at the risk of sounding immodest, I was the first civil society leader to be invited to give the World Bank Presidential Fellows Lecture in 2003, normally reserved for heads of state and finance ministers. So we are committed to engagement. And Kemal, I consider him a very close friend. We've been involved in various other things outside of the global governance system. And likewise, Pascal was at a meeting, generously gave his time when Civicus brought together annually the CEOs of the biggest international NGOs last year in Geneva. So be assured, we know that. However, try to understand the world I'm living in. I'm living in a world where every single day we know. I'm also, by the way, the co-chair of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, which is the umbrella body of trade unions, NGOs, and so on. We live in a world where every single day more than 30,000 people are dying from preventable causes. In my continent, 6,000 people die of HIV/AIDS alone every single day. More than that die from malaria every single day. When you add those figures, if you want to put it in terms of global imagery, we have, in terms of loss of human life, we have the equivalent of 5 9/11s every single day on the African continent. So where I'm coming from is a sense for real urgency. The work Pascal is doing at the WTO is critically important in terms of a trading system that is not working for the poor. We have double standards in the sense that on the one hand we have nations preaching free trade, on the other they are actually practicing protectionism and so on. And unless the system is transparent, is democratic and so on, and I just want to say to Bob, my point when I talked about the presidency and the not a transparent open search process and so on, it was not about the World Bank itself. We are equally appalled that the IMF as a virtual guarantee of the managing director being from the, and we don't want the US or the Europe and so on to move out. But the question that I'll close with, we must be very careful that we are, like for example, readjusting shares and so on. In my mind, it's like sort of rearranging the chairs on the Titanic while it's about to sink. Right? What we need is a really hard look at how do we balance two things. Don't scrap the entire system overnight. That's not what we are saying. We need to make the best of a system that's imperfect, and I have faith in some of the folks around here who are trying to do that, and we will support them to do that. However, simultaneously, we have to ask the question, how can we actually look at the macro structural changes that are needed to ensure that the world has a genuinely democratic, efficient global governance system that can deliver to all the citizens in the world, not only those that might reside in rich countries.
Thank you. We've got time. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So if the questioners would identify themselves, keep the question short, and if the responders could also try to get the answers short, then we can maybe deal with maybe 2 more questions. So.
One question and one small comment. What is the impact of what we see in Gaza on the future of our global governance, particularly in this area? People have followed our rule of democracy, of choosing a government which we did not like. The comment is extremism does not have a country or a religion or a boundary or a culture. Extremism, fundamentalism, and terrorism is a global issue, and we should all fight it collectively without linking it to any religion or race or a country. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take this question from the panel? I think I took it as a comment, and I think it's a comment that is registered. Your point of view has been registered. I think it was referred to earlier in the context of some of the opening remarks that this is an issue that does need true global collaboration to deal with. One more question here. If you'd identify yourself.
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. I'd like to ask the panel about where there may be big gaps in global governance. It seems 2 areas are the environment and energy. Post-Kyoto, will we not need some new global organisation to administer the system? Or perhaps, as Gordon Brown says, the World Bank could be turned into an environmental bank. Second area is energy markets. Would there not be a case for a small informal grouping bringing together the main producers and the main consumers of energy, meeting together, trying to ensure a stable, benign energy market? I think the other smaller countries might be quite happy if such a body could create a stable, ordered energy market, even if they weren't part of that small group.
Well, I think some of these issues have come up in the context of WTO. So, Pascal?
Very, very shortly. I don't agree with Charles that there is no environmental governance on this planet. You've got a myriad of multilateral environmental agreements. They all have their secretariat, and UNEP is sort of trying to work as an umbrella for all this. But it's a perfect example of networked global governance. Now, whether it works that well or not is another question, but we have one. we don't have a World Environmental Organization, but we have a network of organizations and secretariat that administer various agreements in a perfectly Westphalian way. On energy, we don't have a world energy, although we have some organizations. It's simply because that's the last refuge of the nation-state sovereignty in economic life. And we know that, and it's been there for a long time. And unless technology reshuffles totally that, it will remain that this way. And we know that in WTO, where it is the sector of economic life where the rules of WTO have never been made precise, just by coincidence.
Thank you. Ogata-san would actually like to take your question. I'm glad to hear that. So, Ogata-san, would you like to?
Just both the two questions together. Gaza, I have been horrified. I have been to Gaza. We have done some assistance to the infrastructure, and then the economy, and then the humanitarian aspects of Gaza and so on. It is horrifying. But what shall I say? Put the two questions together. Where is the gap? I think the development agency, economic development agency, trade agency, or in general, look at the economic development part as if that brings peace. And I think that assumption is not correct, because a lot of the development, economic assistance, trade, we have to look much more into the question of the socio-political impact on the people. And this gap between economic study, economic operation, and political social operations is something that is a reality. And I can say that because I was much more in the humanitarian work. And this sometimes, the economic assistance work continued does cause a lot more socio-political imbalances. And maybe this is, I don't have to cite all the countries around that we see every day now. Gaza is one of the extremes, but we have seen what happened in Kenya. These are things that we have, and the global governance system may be too divided. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, and let me just make a kind of a summary comment. I think what we've heard from the panel today is a view that the best way forward is to try to make the existing long-standing multilateral organizations work and be more effective with greater participation that's representative of the world as we see it today. That confers legitimacy, and it brings us to a better chance, I think, particularly if we allow for participation, including some form of effective participation from civil society. I want to thank the panelists, and please would you join me in giving them a warm round of applause.